Okay, well, our topic for today is we're going to be discussing the great men who have built the Empire City. Unfortunately, we haven't had any great women yet, so here's a challenge out there for those of you who would like to redesign New York. There are plenty of possibilities. So, the master builders of the Empire City. We'll be going through various people. First, George Washington, who we really don't think of as a great builder of New York, but he was. Governor DeWitt Clinton, the famous John Jacob Astor, Andrew Haswell Green, the great architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White. Probably the most famous of all the great builders of New York would be Robert Moses. And then, of course, we have to talk about Donald Trump, who's busily out there changing the face of the city. Well, the first master builder is, in fact, George Washington. On this map on the left, we see the Dutch land claim of the Dutch colonial empire in America, which includes half of Connecticut, all of New York State, and down into New Jersey, large chunks of Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, as well as Long Island. So the Dutch had a claim which was huge when we consider the size of the other 13 colonies. So Peter Stuyvesant, probably the most famous governor of New York under the Dutch period, viewed New York, or New Amsterdam as it was called, as the capital of an empire. It was not Boston, it was just a religious colony in Massachusetts, or even Philadelphia later on, which was capital of Pennsylvania, but New Amsterdam was the capital of an empire. Well, George Washington gave this idea of New York as more than just an ordinary city, but as the capital of an empire, when in 1785 he wrote a letter to Mayor Duane of New York City, where he described New York City as the seat of an empire. And don't forget, under George Washington, New York was not only the leading city of the 13 colonies, but it was also the capital of the United States. And so this myth of New York City as an empire city, begun first by Peter Stuyvesant and then given recognition by George Washington when he called it the Empire City. This is the myth of New York as an empire city. And in this slide we see the famous painting by Thomas Cole, who depicted in 1836 his vision of the future of New York City. Now you have to be creative. Remember, Thomas Cole was a painter, the greatest of the Hudson River painters. And in this painting we see the Hudson River, and on both sides of it we see the Greek and Roman temples of his future vision of New York City. Now don't forget, back in the 1830s, the United States was also building its new capital on a very different river, which became eventually the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C. And if anybody's been to Washington, D.C., they know that all the buildings are of Greek and Roman architecture. So Thomas Cole's depiction of New York as the Empire City was not that far from reality. And George Washington's vision took other forms, not only Thomas Cole's paintings, but we have the book by Paul Goodman, The Empire City, postcards proclaiming New York the Empire City, and of course Kenneth Jackson, one of the greatest historians of New York, describing New York as the Empire City. So from the very beginning we can consider Peter Stuyvesant and especially George Washington as a person who gave a real identity to New York City, an identity that placed New York on a par with London, Paris, Rome, Jerusalem, and the great empire cities of antiquity. Well, the second master builder of the city was another great governor, DeWitt Clinton. As the name DeWitt Clinton says, a perfect New York knickerbocker, Dutch, as in the name DeWitt, and Clinton, the English name. So he was the one who decided that he was going to build in bricks and mortar the great city of New York. He was going to create on the ground the vision of Peter Stuyvesant, Thomas Cole, and George Washington. And here we see his famous grid plan. On the left, we see the darker area, the bottom of Manhattan, which was the Old English and Dutch city. Well, DeWitt Clinton ordered his engineers to survey the entire island of Manhattan, laying out the grid plan of streets and avenues. Now, this was back in 1807. It was finally finished in 1811. And someone made the comment, why spend all this money laying out all of these streets and avenues on an island which at the time was mainly trees and forests and small villages and Indians and wild animals? And he shocked everybody when he said, one day New York City will have a population of millions. He said, I am laying out the city of the future. And gradually, over the centuries, this grid plan became a reality. Now, if you look closely at the grid plan, you see there's no Central Park. DeWitt Clinton had no time for parks and for pretty avenues or boulevards or anything like that. He was a functional master builder. He was building an industrial commercial city of the future. Well, DeWitt Clinton is also the man who gave us the current City Hall. And once again, when he was asked, why are you spending so much money on an expensive city hall filled with marble and gilt and domes? Plus, it was too big for the city of his time. Everybody said, we don't need all this room. And once again, he responded, I am building a city of the future. I'm building the Empire City, which will one day have a population of millions. Well, his third great contribution to the city, not only the grid plan but City Hall, was the building of the Erie Canal we see in the central slide, which linked New York City with Buffalo, New York. Well, we might think, well, what's so important about the Erie Canal? But if we look at the map on the right, we see the huge area of the Louisiana Purchase. This area, which became the grain-producing area of the United States. Before the Erie Canal, if you had a farm in the Midwest, you had to put your food on a riverboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, transfer it to an ocean-going vessel, which would then bring the food around Florida and up to New York, which meant that by the time your potatoes got to New York City from your farm in Wisconsin, half of them were rotten. But if you could put them on a lake boat, send them to Buffalo, across the Erie Canal and down to New York, 90% of them arrived in good shape. The price of food in New York City plummeted with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. The price is estimated dropped by 25 to 50%, which meant if you were going to set up a textile factory, you would do it in New York and not in Philadelphia or Boston or Baltimore. So because of DeWitt Clinton, New York City began to grow in leaps and bounds. And by the end of his tenure in 1848, New York City was the second largest city in the world after London. And this is thanks to DeWitt Clinton's future vision. Well, of course, if he's building a giant city for millions, New York City needed fresh water. DeWitt Clinton is the one who came up with the idea of the Croton Reservoir we see on the map on the left, bringing fresh water down from the Adirondack Mountains, from upstate New York, bringing it down into the city through giant tanks. And on the far right, we see the famous reservoir, which stands where the New York Public Library is today, which gave New York already back in the 1840s the freshest fresh water of any city in the United States. So we have so much to thank Governor DeWitt Clinton for really taking Peter Stuyvesant and George Washington and Thomas Cole's idealistic vision, almost a utopian vision, and beginning to turn it into a concrete reality of buildings and of streets and avenues with workers and factories and fresh water and cheap food. Well, the next great master builder of the New York of the future was John Jacob Astor. Well, here we see the picture of this rather hard-working German Protestant who migrated to the United States. He was born in 1763, came to the United States in 1783, at the time of George Washington as president. And by the time he died in 1848, he was the richest man in America. The son of a German butcher who until the end of his days spoke lousy English, had atrocious table manners, but he threw himself into building New York City as the Empire City. He's the one who came up with the idea of filling in all of these empty blocks that were laid out by the grid plan and filling them with houses. So he was the great real estate speculator of his age. He came up with the idea of building his mansions on corner lots so that the entrance was not on the avenue, which was filled with traffic, but was on the more quiet street. So he would build a house for himself or someone of his family on a corner lot. And then, of course, everybody wanted to live near John Jacob Astor or one of the Astors. But as soon as the block was filled with houses, the Astor family moved out and moved further north and built another corner mansion, and just waiting for it to be filled up with successful people. So we remember John Jacob Astor for many reasons, not only Astoria in Queens, but the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And for his family, he built an entire neighborhood, which is today called Astor Place. And on this slide, we see the subway sign for Astor Place, and below it we see the red line, which is Astor Place, which is a street, which, as you can see, defies the grid plan. It's over on the east side. We see Stuyvesant Street and St. Mark's Place, and he laid out a street for him and his family and relatives. And on the right, we see Astor Row, one of the very first block-long apartment buildings of New York, built back in the 1840s. And below it was the Astor Opera House and the Astor Theater. So John Jacob Astor was not only a master builder, but he inaugurated a very rich New York tradition of not only building something, but plastering your name all over it. So you might say he was one of the very first Donald Trumps of his age, or Rockefellers of his age, putting his name all over everything, letting the world know that he is a master builder. Well, along came still another great builder of New York City, less known than Astor or Washington or Stuyvesant or even Thomas Cole, and this is Andrew Haswell Green. And born in 1820, when New York was already off and running, and lived until 1903. He is considered the father of Greater New York. Now, when we say Greater New York, we are talking about the consolidation of the 5 boroughs into one city. And that is really what he is most famous for. But he was also a visionary of the future. New York, as it was growing in the 1820s and 40s and 50s, and especially as it approached the Civil War, New York, in spite of its imperial pretensions as the Empire City, had an inferiority complex. It was growing in numbers. It was becoming industrialized. But yet, New York did not have a king or a prince or a duke who could build lavish gardens behind his palace and open them on Sunday to the elite of the cities of Vienna or London or Paris or Berlin or St. Petersburg. What New York lacked was a public garden to rival those of the great cities of Europe. And so it was Green who came up with the idea of building a central park. Now remember, the Central Park was not envisaged by the grid plan of 1807, but it was Haswell's idea. Now here we see the outline of the park, which was built in 1857 and finished 1873, beginning at 59th Street, extending up to 110th Street. Now the next time you visit Central Park, note that you go in by a gate. The park is surrounded by a wall, and it has gates. And when the park opened, every gate had a policeman. You had to be properly dressed. You had to be of a certain social class. It was not a park for people to go in to walk on the grass, to lay on a bench, or even to eat a sandwich. There were guards at the gate, and it was basically a display area for the city's elite. When it opened, it was closed on Sunday because any good Christian was in church on Sunday. Frivolous practices of walking in the park or riding your carriage in the park was not permitted. The park did not have restaurants. It did not have playgrounds. You stayed on the paths, and it was a park by the elite and for the elite. But when it was completed, beginning in Civil War time, the lower area was opened. New York could claim that it had the largest park completely inside the city limits of any city in the world, a park that could rival the great gardens and parks of London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. So this was Haswell Green's great contribution to New York City, a park in the center of the city. He is also the father of consolidation. In 1898, when New York City, which at the time was just Manhattan, absorbed Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx into a giant city, which was rivaled only by London in size. And don't forget, in 1898, New York, which was then Manhattan, was the largest city in the United States, and Brooklyn, which we see on the picture on the right in green, was the third largest city in the United States, Chicago being the second largest city. So basically, the first and the third cities of the United States merged into one great city called Greater New York. And the population of the city jumped from 1.8 million to 3.4 million. Well, there was one thing to build or to consolidate the 5 boroughs, but if we look at the map on the right, we see that Manhattan and Brooklyn are divided by the East River. And to show that the city was now one city, a German immigrant by the name of John Augustus Roebling, who was born in Germany in 1806 and came to the United States, came up with the idea of building the Brooklyn Bridge to solidify Greater New York into one great city. So beginning in 1869 to 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge united the first and the third largest cities of the United States. In doing research for this paper, I came across a fascinating little tidbit which I didn't even know about. And that was Roebling came up with the idea of bridging Manhattan and Brooklyn, and he barely beat out an alternative proposal, which was to fill in the East River and to make it geographically one city where Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens would be linked by landfill, and so New York would simply expand, because basically the East River is not a river, it's just an inlet from the ocean. And so when that was finally defeated, Roebling won the great debate, and the Brooklyn Bridge was built, the longest and the most elegant and the most beautiful bridge ever built until that time. And we can see that when it was opened in 1883, the city was filled with fireworks and great festivities, because for the first time New York was linked with Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens into one great city. Now, in addition to the great city planners and builders, architects played a very important role in building New York. And so I include people, the architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White, for example, as the great master builders. Because having a park and having a giant city and having a huge population was one thing. But unlike Europe, New York, by the time of the Civil War, still did not have majestic architecture that could rival the great cities of London, Vienna, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. And so into this gap came several great architects and architectural firms, most of them trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, because the United States still didn't have great architectural schools. And when we look at these buildings, the one on the left is the main campus of Columbia University. In the middle we see the Harvard Club, and then on the right we see the great arch of Washington Square, built by the McKim, Mead and White architectural firm. Stanford White probably is the most famous of all of them, and his name is on many of these buildings. But here again we see the influence of European architecture. The Washington Arch on the right is definitely taken from Paris or from ancient Rome. The Renaissance Harvard Club in the middle, and the classical Roman Columbia University library building. They were to give New York a European elegance that it didn't have until approximately the Civil War, when there were enough rich people to start sponsoring these majestic buildings. Another great firm was Carrier and Hastings, which is responsible for, on the left, we see the majestic New York Public Library. I love that picture because we see when it was finished and when it was being built in the very late 1800s and early 1900s, the city was still filled with horses and buggies. Now when you go by, you see buses and cars and taxis going up the very same street which were filled with horses and buggies. Once again, it was to recreate the European elegance of the empire cities of London, Paris, and Vienna. On the right, we see the old Metropolitan Opera, a huge interior space where the great operas of Europe were performed. The opera company, of course, like the Philharmonic, was founded by German immigrants coming over after the revolutions of 1848 in Germany. And at the bottom we see the Frick Museum, one of the very first mansion built with the intention of becoming a public museum when old Mr. Frick passed away. So these architects drew upon Europe to embellish New York City especially Fifth Avenue, with museums, lavish hotels, libraries, majestic churches, St. Patrick's Cathedral, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, were to recreate in the New World the elegance, the opulence, and the imperial status of the great cities of Europe. Now moving forward, another man steps into the picture. The man that every New Yorker and every urban planner loves to hate or to love is Robert Moses. Once again, a great mind who intentionally drug the city of New York out of the age of horse and buggies and forced it into the age of the automobile. Here was he born 1888 to 1981, almost an entire century. He never once held elected public office. He had a whole variety of small positions, public parks director, or rather unimportant positions, but single-handedly he attracted the money to really transform the city into the new century. Ironically, the man who drugged the city into the 20th century never had a driver's license. The man who built the Triborough Bridge, 1936, once again linking three boroughs of New York City. The man who transformed the city through parkways, through highways, through superhighways for the new automobile, never had a driver's license in his life. He never drove a car. In fact, he took great pride in sitting in the back seat of his limousine, like the one we see from 1929, being chauffeured around the city like some feudal baron. But yet he enabled millions of New Yorkers to take to their automobiles after World War I, to leave the city and to go to places like Jones Beach. And here we see the famous tower of Jones Beach, the water tower, the changing rooms. And if you look at the picture on the right and on the left, we see parking lots for tens of thousands of automobiles. Back then, most automobiles, the old Fords, were black in color. And I often wonder, if you went to Jones Beach, after you got done and you went looking for your car, if they were all identical, how could you possibly find your car? I mean, it must have been a real conundrum for all these people who were taking to the cars. But not only Jones Beach, all the parks in upstate New York, the parkways, which could take you out into the middle of Long Island. And so he really took New York and drug it into the age of the automobile. But yet he had a historical sense. He was not dealing with a tabula rasa. He was not building a new city. He was the heir to Thomas Cole, to George Washington, to Peter Stuyvesant, to Haswell Green. Even the name of Jones Beach, the famous Jones family, the family that gave us the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, when they moved from their farm, which is today Jones Beach, into Washington Square and built a beautiful brownstone. They were considered the arbiters of taste of Lower Manhattan and especially of Lower Fifth Avenue. And so if the Jones family did something, everybody was doing it. If Mrs. Jones got a new hat, then every woman on Washington Square in Lower Manhattan had to have a hat just like Mrs. Jones. And so that's the phrase, keeping up with Jones family. But Robert Moses also gave us the infamous Cross Bronx Expressway, which it's worth driving across it to see how it just cut through old ethnic neighborhoods. And he even planned to do the same thing, building an expressway right through the East Village and Greenwich Village and completely demolishing Washington Square, which was mercifully resisted. But still, he made the city a city friendly to automobiles, transformed it from the horse and buggy age to the age of the automobile. Robert Moses also brought us the World's Fair of 1939-1940, and exhibits such as the Futurama not only celebrated New York's emergence as an empire city, as a city to rival London and Paris and the other great cities of the world, but he had a fair to celebrate it, and it was very future-oriented. When we look at the picture in the middle, we see General Motors building, ultra-modern architecture, which makes us think of Frank Lloyd Wright, rejecting the square box, the brick, the square rooms, and totally innovative architecture for the age of the automobile. And on the right we see the various exhibits, the Sphere and the Tower, where New York really celebrated its fame as a great city of the world. Robert Moses was one of the greatest urban planners of the city. He also came up with the idea of the famous Lincoln Center, which was revolutionary because for the first time New York City viewed itself not as streets and avenues with buildings filling up these blocks, but Robert Moses conceived of urban planning as a collective of buildings. And when you go to Lincoln Center, you see the opera, the Philharmonic, as well as the Juilliard School, and in fact a total of 18 buildings forming a cultural complex, which was a total shattering of the grid plan, in fact, in uniting a whole series of blocks, putting streets underground and linking a group of buildings into a cluster. This was earlier pioneered by the famous Rockefeller Center, which is a whole collection of buildings with underground subway stations. And Robert Moses' other great contribution to the city was the complex of the United Nations building, which gathered a whole series of buildings into a cluster. And that was really his broader vision of urban planning, not just streets and avenues, but complexes of buildings. Now, of course, Robert Moses was universally controversial. The famous debate with Jane Jacobs, who viewed people like Robert Moses as murderers of the city which she had known, growing up in Lower Manhattan, in ethnic neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, Little Italy, Chinatown. Robert Moses had no appreciation of these ethnic neighborhoods where kids would play in the streets, and every mother in the neighborhood was the mother of every kid in the neighborhood, where ethnic groups spoke their dialects, had their food, had their holidays. Robert Moses rejected that as being an old-fashioned city and said we should build a city where everybody would be assimilated into giant apartment blocks and giant parking lots and freeways and parkways going from one area of the city to the other. A very famous book about Robert Moses, also controversial, is The Power Broker by Robert Caro. Once again underlining the fact that a man who was never elected to public office, he was not a mayor or a governor, he was appointed to various positions, but yet he single-handedly was able to transform the city to build an entire new city on the grid plan, which preserved many elements of its history, but it sort of catapulted the city into the future. Jane Jacobs lamented this future vision of Robert Moses, and you can see the title of her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She was a firm believer in ethnic neighborhoods, where, as Robert Moses said, ethnic neighborhoods had fulfilled their destiny, and a new race was emerging, the race of an American. And whether they lived in a high-rise apartment building or in a suburb, the link between these was the automobile. Now, the last great master builder of the city are people like Donald Trump, who once again view the city as a palette for great artists, great builders, great engineers, and great planners to achieve their visions and to achieve their dreams. Now, Donald Trump, who you might be aware is also running for president, so maybe in a future version of this I will have to put in President Trump, but his attitude was, the city is there, and every generation reshapes the city. Just like Robert Moses drugged the city into the age of the automobile and suburbs and highways, Donald Trump saw the city as a way of celebrating American capitalism, the triumph of the individual, of the independent entrepreneur, who would buy an entire block of the city, tear down old buildings, and build a towering edifice which has his name on it. And so here we see the famous Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, where the Trump offices are located, the Trump commercial empire is located. And Trump has not only Trump Tower, but many Trump buildings in New York, the Trump International Hotel, but he has even taken this attitude abroad and into other cities, where half a dozen buildings in Las Vegas and in Atlantic City and in other places have the name Trump on them. Once again, sort of an Ayn Rand approach to the triumph of the individual, capitalistic spirit. And this was very much pioneered by our good friend John Jacob Astor, who was the first to plaster his name on everything he could find. The Waldorf Astoria. Here we see the old Waldorf Astoria, which is where the Croton Reservoir used to be, which was where the Empire State Building presently is. And once again, he not only named the hotel after his own family, the Astor family, but named it after his small village where his father was a butcher back in Bavaria, the town of Waldorf, which is German. Wald means forest, and Dorf means the village, a forest village. And here we see the majestic Waldorf Astoria. In the middle, we see the Astor Hotel, which is one of the very first hotels to have the Astor name. On the top, we see the other Hotel Astor. We see Astor Place, which is still there, and of course Astoria, Queens. And like Donald Trump, John Jacob Astor had no problem spreading his fame on a national scale. There's a city on the west coast, I think it's Oregon or Washington, called Astoria. There's an Astor River. So he had no problem celebrating his triumph as a great master builder and transforming it onto a global scale. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was another person who had no problems transforming his name into a landmark status. He not only was on the Time magazine cover, but he named the entire complex of buildings after himself. Now, many people say that John D. Rockefeller Sr., who is generally listed among the names of the great robber barons of the city, that John D. Rockefeller Jr. was trying to make up for the sins of his father by building not only Rockefeller Center, but Riverside Church for his good friend Reverend Fosdick, and Rockefeller University as sort of a penance for his father's sins. But still it reflected that attitude that a great city should honor its great citizens, and that the great citizens have a duty to embellish the city, whether it is through Haswell Central Park or through hotels or through entire neighborhoods, as in Astoria, Queens. So we have John D. Rockefeller, we have Astor, we have Trump putting their names on famous buildings. One of the most interesting buildings I find in having a collection of names is the New York Public Library, where if you look closely, you not only see the two lions, patience and fortitude, but up at the top you see the three names of the people who came together to establish the library. Once again, John Jacob Astor Library, which transferred its books to the new citywide institution. James Lennox, one of the great Presbyterian leaders of the city. Samuel Tilden Library. The three merged, and their names are emblazoned on the top of the New York Public Library. Well, in the course of history, other people have also contributed greatly to this library, and once again demanded that their names appear somewhere on the building as a great contributor to the city of New York. Most recently, Stephen A. Schwarzman donated several $1 million to the complete refurbishing of the New York Public Library. If anybody's used a reading room lately, they'll see that it has been beautifully restored and is absolutely brilliant in color. But he demanded that his name be put on the front of the building. It took me a couple years to get used to the main branch building being called the Schwarzman Building. But if you go online and order a book, you'll see that it is named Schwarzman. So we've seen that altogether the great master builders of the city, where a great city attracts people. It wants people to contribute. People want to be part of this ongoing historic flowering of a great city, where New York is a tabula rasa, where great people emerge, achieve success, transform the city, and then leave their name on its great buildings, its neighborhoods, its edifices, and this will probably continue into the future. I'm just waiting for the first Hispanic to leave his mark on the city. Or the great master builders who will be in the future will be women, will be Chinese immigrants, will be Muslims, will be people of all backgrounds. New York City is that kind of city that just cries out for great individuals, great master builders to step up to the plate and leave their mark on the city.